You're listening to the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Now, it is time to break it down.
Welcome to episode number 23 of the Sonny Brown Breakdown. I'm your host, Sonny Brown, and in this episode, I talk to Rob Biernacki of Ireland Top Team. He also runs BJJconcepts.net, and we discuss his thoughts on pedagogy in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, different cognitive learning strategies, and gamification of Jiu-Jitsu drills, which he calls micro battles, as well as getting into developing a mentality for fun and longevity within the sport. We also get to discuss how his geographic isolation out there at Ireland Top Team kind of forced a diversity in his information set, as well as discussing his rank requirements for what makes a black belt, which he says he has some people training with him that will never be able to reach that level of a black belt. And also at the end, he goes on an epic rant about the proliferation of conspiracy theories within BJJ circles. So I hope you enjoy the interview. In the meantime, remember you can find out more at sonnybrown.net, and also follow me on Instagram at sonnybrownbreakdown. Now let's go to the podcast. G'day, Rob. How are you today, mate?
I'm doing awesome.
Excellent, excellent. Now, Rob, big fan of your work. See you online with your YouTube, or when doing a lot of work with Stephen Kesting, and you're very vocal on some other podcasts that I've heard with like BJJ Mental Models. You know, got some strong opinions that I quite enjoy listening to. And so I've reached out to get in touch just to have a chat about basically, you know, what some of your thoughts are on teaching and learning and different styles of pedagogy within Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Just wondering, maybe we can just start with, what was your background in learning Jiu-Jitsu, and how, you know, kind of how were you taught?
So my background was a little bit disparate in that I was living in Toronto, Canada, and I was training with I had a friend at the time who was he was still a brown belt when I started really training with him. So I started training, I guess about around 2002, but as part of like overall MMA training. So I was not a dedicated Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy. Like I said, I had a friend who was a brown belt. I trained at his gym, you know, maybe once or twice a week. And I did a lot of no-gi rolling at, MMA clubs, that kind of stuff. And then I started getting a little more dedicated about the jiu-jitsu aspect of MMA when I started going down to American Top Team, which is probably around 2004. So my coach was Charles McCarthy at American Top Team, but I wasn't there all the time. I would go down, you know, a few weeks at a time, and then that became, you know, a few months at a time, probably around 2010, until I got my black belt in 2012. So because I was, to a certain degree, left to my own devices, I cobbled together a bunch of different things. I went through a pretty long phase of being the move chaser guy. Like, in other words, if I lost a roll, the reason had to be that I didn't know enough moves. You know, if I got armbarred, it meant I didn't know enough armbar escapes. If I couldn't submit someone, it meant I didn't know enough submissions. And I kept going down this rabbit hole of, you know, like learning, you know, 10th planet, and then learning leg locks and learning this and learning that, and just trying to amass moves. And it didn't matter how many moves I amassed. I would always get smashed by good guys. And it was a really weird, like, I was the kind of guy who would annihilate people who were even a little bit worse than me, but I would get totally destroyed by people who were a little bit better than me. It's like there was no in between. If somebody had good positional jiu-jitsu, they would be able to handle me unless they had a deficiency in their leg lock defense, and I could catch them with that. And then if somebody was, you know, like not as good as I was at, you know, positional stuff, then I could just catch them all over the place. But it's almost like I never had competitive roles. I was either kicking someone's ass, or I was getting my ass kicked. And it's just because I didn't have a proper understanding of what I now really like try to promulgate, which is like fundamental conceptual understanding of alignment, base posture, strike, all the stuff I preach, which I was exposed to in the best I would say the best presentation of it that I was exposed to was from Ryan Hall, because he was the first guy that sort of spoke my language, spoke the language of physics, of biomechanics, and of like comical nerd kind of references in his instructionals, that kind of stuff. So that was somebody that I really looked up to once I was exposed to his work. And so that, yeah, like my training ended up being training with a lot of different people, and then focusing exclusively on the gi around 2010. So I left leg locks completely alone and just did a lot of gi training. Really didn't start back up. I got my black belt in 2012, and then I didn't really roll no-gi for probably about 3 years. And then I started getting back into no-gi. I did a competition in Portland, and I started doing some no-gi training for that. I won a match via heel hook, and then I lost in the finals via heel hook. And I was like, man, I'm never the guy who's the worst leg locker in an exchange. But that was from like 5 years ago, right? So that's when I went out and I trained with Eddie Cummings, and I got caught up on the leg lock game. And now people probably know me more as a no-gi leg lock kind of guy. But yeah, for a little while there, I was just gi only and very focused on fundamental, conceptually sound positional jiu-jitsu. So I'm kind of a mix of those two approaches. And then as far as like my teaching approach, the pretentious word for it is I'm an autodidact, which is I'm largely self-taught. Prior to opening my club, which took away all my free time, I used to read probably a couple of books a week, all nonfiction, mostly science, and I tried to stay as abreast as I could of like developments in like cognitive science, anything related to like sports and training and stuff like that. So, I'm not as up on it as I used to be, but luckily I have one of my black belts now who is kind of doing the same thing I used to do and just reading up on it. So at our academy, between my previous research into it and my black belt, his name's Cal McDonald, his current research into it, we try to keep evolving our pedagogy systems to reflect the state of the art in cognitive learning strategies.
Beautiful. And you mentioned Ryan Hall there early on in the piece. Was he someone you'd worked with personally, or was that just the influence from his?
I traveled after not after so before I got my black belt, I traveled around for a little bit. And so I was at Ryan Hall's academy for a couple of weeks, and I was at Marcelo Garcia's for a couple of weeks. And then after that, I traveled around and trained with a few other people. Like, I'm a pretty prolific, like, travel to train guy. There's certainly some people that I want to train with that I haven't had a chance to yet, but the list of people that I wanted to train with and then got to train with, that bucket list is getting increasingly filled. So yeah, I was very fortunate to get to train with him, not extensively or anything, but yeah, definitely something I wanted to do.
Nice. And you're out there at Vancouver Island, I believe. You
Yes.
Previously referred to it as the New Zealand of Canada.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, because you've kind of, evolved into your own direction, even though I believe you're associated or affiliated with Kyotera at the moment.
Yeah, we're a Kyotera affiliate, yeah.
But you've certainly got your own style that seems to be pretty unique to what you're doing. How much would you say that being kind of isolated where you are has enabled you to be able to develop that?
I think it's been like a significant contribution. One of the sort of formative bits of information that I got prior to opening my school was I saw an interview with, I want to say it was Hodger Gracie, and it was describing his thought process when he had moved to England, as basically as far as what he was looking to do in his jiu-jitsu career and how he was able to achieve such incredible feats without being surrounded by really high-level training partners. So his approach, I basically just stole his approach, which is take every student that I can that develops an aptitude or an interest in a particular game and try to maximize that particular student in that particular game so that I would have a variety of training partners that were challenging, even if the overall role might not be challenging against a blue belt. If I could make that blue belt, a brown belt in one position, then I could battle them in that position. And so what that forced me to do is become as educated as possible in these different positions that I wanted to teach. So I would seek out, whether it was in traveling and training with somebody, or online or DVD, whatever, like any kind of resources I could find that allowed me to model the best practices of the best practitioners at a particular guard or submission or whatever. And then I would teach that material to, I'd teach all the stuff that I was learning to my students once I felt comfortable enough to convey the information. But there's a difference between what I feel comfortable teaching to a class and what I feel comfortable giving to one person who's working on something. My philosophy is I won't teach something, let's say, publicly until I've personally been working on it for about a year. I don't like taking information that is still in development for me and teaching it. So there would be things that I wouldn't teach in the general class, but that I was working on. So if I would take a student aside and do a private training session, like a drilling session, just for my sake, where I was using them as a training partner. And so I would say, okay, I want to work on this and I want you to give me these responses, and I would try to coach them through it. So yeah, like I took that Haji Gracie approach of try to make different people as good as possible at different things. And so that created an ongoing process for me of, I want to get good at this guard. Okay, now we're going to get good at this. Now we're going to get good at this. Now we're going to get good at that. So I would say that as far as my ability to teach different positions, there aren't too many positions in jiu-jitsu that I don't feel comfortable teaching at this point. Because it was just I'm not awesome at them, and I'm not like saying that I can play all these positions extremely well, but the same way, like my wrestling knowledge is pretty good. My actual wrestling is garbage. Like I'm a shitty wrestler, but I've trained, like at American Top Team, I trained with some really elite level wrestlers, and I've got, I train now with Yuri Simoes, like anytime he's getting ready for ADCC. I've been part of his camps for the last 3 years, so I've had access to him. I think he's easily one of the best wrestlers in jiu-jitsu, and so I've got to sit in on training sessions with him and his wrestling coach, who's amazing. So I've got a really good level of like wrestling information that I might not be able to personally execute because I'm in my 40s and can't put the time into getting good at it. But so it's the same thing with something like, I'm not great at playing Spider Guard, but I can teach it pretty well. So I think the geographic isolation forced me to become as diverse as possible in my information sets that I could pass on to students with the goal of making them exceptional training partners.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then with that, the way that then you decided to present that information to your students to build them up in their different areas, did that mean that from the get-go you were looking at changing how you were teaching your students as opposed to how you were taught yourself?
Yeah, very much so. So prior to launching my club, I tried to sit down and design a curriculum, but not a curriculum in the sense that most people think of it. So like when most people think of a curriculum, they might think of the Gracie Barra curriculum or the 10th Planet curriculum, where it's like, here are these moves that we do. And we drill these moves, and this week we're working on these moves, and the next week we're going. So I really wasn't trying to do that, although I did create modules that are based around positions. So the first thing when I was creating our pedagogy system was I wanted to have the ability to focus people on a position for about a month. So every month we would do a module, and that module might be a specific guard, it might be a passing format, it might be a submission control position, but everything had to be grounded in the fundamental concepts that I teach, which are basically an expansion of the concepts that I got from Ryan Hall. So the idea of focusing on base posture structure, frames and levers, and then adding in the emphasis on wedges after training with Eddie Cummings and that kind of stuff. So that was the foundation of it, was have concepts that become entrenched so that people can solve problems when they arise that aren't pre-programmed. So one thing I don't believe in, and I think there will probably be some overlap in what I'm saying between what School of Grappling, I don't know the guy's actual name, but
and Andy.
Andy, there you go. So what Andy, which like for anybody who is watching this or listening who isn't exposed to Andy's work, at School of Grappling on Instagram, schoolofgrappling.com, I think is his website. Just awesome stuff. Again,
Phenomenal.
like somebody who echoes a lot of the same ideas that I have about training, although I think he's quite a bit more wrestling based in terms of his techniques.
Yeah, judo background, but now he's all focused on wrestling.
Yeah. So he puts a lot of material out about this idea of, I think he calls it training the gray areas and focusing on skills rather than techniques. And so like I use maybe slightly different terminology, but if I could draw a comparison to our Fuck Your Jiu-Jitsu drills, which are all based around, and I know when you had Rory on, he kind of explained Fuck Your Jiu-Jitsu, but those drills are all based around the idea of giving people problems to solve and gamifying the process of solving those problems, and then putting them in positions to work on skill sets that are usually considered intangibles in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I think is really wrong. I think that the way that, and again, I'm not trying to like throw anybody under the bus, but the way that we teach people in jiu-jitsu is so just, it's ass backwards, because all the high level competitors, they develop these skills that, again, most people think are intangible. It's like guard retention. Most people at most academies that don't compete have garbage guard retention regardless of belt. So, and I noticed that in my travels to different schools, it's like I would roll with a blue belt who competed a lot, and I'd have a really hard time passing the guy's guard. And then I'd roll with a black belt who never competed, and I would run through this guy's guard. Like I would roll with guys who, one of the things I used to do a lot in my own training was I would do what we call no hands guard. So I'd stick my hands in my belt and just defend my guard with my legs. So I had a guard that was pretty tough to pass. And again, like I would roll with brown belts, black belts who couldn't come close to passing my guard without my hands. That shouldn't be a thing. And then I would roll with like, a good tough purple belt competitor. And if I tried the no hands guard thing, the dude would smash my guard, right? So the underlying theme seemed to be that every good competitor has these subsets of skills that they get very good at. And guard retention is one of them. Passing is another. Being difficult to sweep is another one. And so when I was developing the Fuck Your Jiu-Jitsu like drilling system, that's what I emphasized. It's and sweeping too, like being good at chaining sweeps together, the same way that wrestlers are so good at chaining takedowns together. When you go up against a guy who's like an active competitor, if he goes for a sweep and you shut that sweep down because you know the counter, he'll just go to another thing and another thing and another thing, and then you're on your butt. So those are the things that I emphasized, is developing an ability to connect different sweeping movements together, regardless of what guard you play. There are kind of subsets of sweeping, like the chambering someone's leg on your shoulder for X guard. That's something that you can do regardless of whether you play X guard, regardless of whether you do the classic X guard technical stand-up sweep or not. That's just a single leg done in a different way. So getting people good at the like iterations of those movements is what I was trying to achieve. And that's where Fuck Your Jiu-Jitsu was born. And then the gamifying of it was also born from just doing like just personal experience and understanding how people roll. And then again, watching guys, like I watched Ryan Hall roll quite a bit when I was at his school. So like I would come in for a class and I would do the class, and often he would show up, like if I did the noon class or the 11 a.m. class, I don't remember, but like the earlier class, he didn't teach that class. He taught the evening class, but he would come in And after that class was done, he would roll with Seth or whoever was there, and I would just stay and watch him roll as much as to the extent that I hopefully didn't make him feel uncomfortable. But like I was just trying to watch as much as I could, and I've never seen anybody else roll the way that Ryan Hall rolls in training, and it was so focused on allowing movement to happen. You can see clips of it online of him, like when he's rolling at seminars, or even there's like just some footage of him rolling with like blue belts, and he's like standing on them like a gargoyle and perched on them, like, and he's just working on balance and sensitivity and stuff like that. And so when I was training at his academy, he gave a speech about his training attitude and how, if you sweep him, 99 times, on the 100th time, he's going to walk into your guard like he doesn't give a fuck about your jiu-jitsu and just try to get, whatever experience he can out of it. And that's actually where the name "Fuck Your Jiu-Jitsu" comes from. That's how influenced I am by Ryan Hall. It's from that speech. And then I took just watching him roll and the attitude that he had towards it, and I tried to codify that with a set of rules that created a game out of developing these skills. So like when people first see it, they think of it as situational sparring, but it's not, because situational sparring is too aggressive. It's too much like real rolling, where if somebody's already kind of skillful at a position, they're just going to run their A game in that position over and over again, and it's not playful enough. So the idea behind it was to take, again, like the most current research I had read at the time was based on a book by Malcolm Gladwell, which is a book called Outliers, and it included the 10,000 hour rule, which has largely been debunked at this point. But it included another example of certain cultures that promoted like gamifying, even like, I'll use the specific example was like the Brazilian soccer team, and they would play this indoor soccer variant, which was like 5-on-5 or something, where they got a lot more time with ball handling and passing, and like the walls were in place, so they were basically just having fun. They weren't really trying to, obviously you're trying to win, but they were able to have fun with subsets of skills in soccer. And that was one of the things that contributed to their skill level. Since then, I've become exposed to other examples, like the Finns are unreal at car racing. Like there's a saying in car racing, which is, if you want to win, employ a Finn. And it's because they get so much exposure to car control at an early age through go-karts, through rally racing, through all these different things. And so I very much wanted to try to develop these games, because that was the science at the time, and that has been borne out by more recent research as to how you can take athletes from a minimal level of skill to a maximal level of skill by focusing on certain things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, big shout out to Andy from School of Grappling. I've spoke to him previously because he really made a lot of big things click for me personally with that idea of the gray zone and gamification as a way to teach both techniques and concepts. Because previously, I'd heard concepts used in jiu-jitsu, obviously, and I'm like, well, yeah, okay, I know a concept, but it's you got to be able to do the move. And then people would say, we've got to do situational sparring, and I'm like, well, we already do it. Like, what's the big deal? Like, yeah, we work from half guard, we work from close guard, like that's situational sparring. But it was really through the conversations with him where, emphasizing the gamification that really clicked for me, that I could understand how it could all kind of merge together. And so I'm wondering then, aside from the Fuck You Jiu-Jitsu game that you've got, what else, what other ways of gamification, or are there other ways of gamification that you've developed?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we do is, because Fuck Your Jiu-Jitsu tends to be, it's one version of a type of restricted drilling. So when we design drills, and I'm actually in the process right now of filming a module for the pedagogy section on our site on how to design drills. And we start with a very narrowly focused drill. And one of the videos I actually talk about chaos or chaotic versus linear progressions. And I talk about chaos theory, which is really arcane, but like,
you'd be surprised how often it's come up in these conversations.
Well, it has to. Like when we're like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has so many analogous traits to chaos theory. So when we're designing drills, we can have a game be something as simple as if we're going to talk about situational sparring, if we're going to say half guard, we're just trying to win an underhook. That can be a game. And that's an incredibly narrow game. And it's one where, if two people are relative beginners and they don't have the skill to have a fuck your jiu-jitsu type round, they can just sit there and like pummel. And as long as it's explained to them what are the contingent parts of, victory in a pummeling exchange, you can do that. So that would be an example of a really focused drill that is a game. It's like as soon as you win an underhook, we stop. And then you can expand that to you win an underhook and you come up to your knees and we stop. And so on and so, like if you want to get really narrow with the games, you can do it that way. We have what we call micro battles, which are games like that. So we'll do something called an arm drag game, where one person is playing seated butterfly guard, and we do this whenever we teach the butterfly guard module and whenever we teach the arm drag module. So you're in a seated butterfly guard, and do you know what sticky hands are in Wing Chun?
Yes, yeah.
So it's almost like sticking hands, where you're not allowed to disconnect your hands from your training partner, and you're hand fighting. And the objective for the person that's playing seated butterfly guard is to gain an arm drag grip, pull the elbow, and just hit an arm drag, just to the point where your body's beside your partner. You don't have to take their back. You don't have to come up on a single leg. You don't have to do anything. It just, as soon as you win the arm drag and get past the center line, the game is over and you start again. And then the person on top, if they win the hand fight, they have to try to stand up and pass. And then the person on bottom just immediately puts butterfly hooks in behind their knees and drops to their back to stop the pass. So there are very definitive endpoints, and we're like, it's not as narrowly focused as maybe pummeling for underhooks, but that's a game that you can play. And man, like we do that game so damn much that, when people come to our gym that have never rolled with somebody that's good at arm drags, man, they just get arm dragged over and over and over and over. So that's just an example of like gamification, where if I just taught my guys the arm drag and then was like, all right, go roll now, try to hit an arm drag, they would never be anywhere near as good at it. So yeah, like we have a lot of different forms of games related to developing very specific skills. We'll do a version of Fuck Your Jiu-Jitsu that's related to wrestling, where we only hand fight. There are no takedowns. We hand fight, and as soon as you get to the hips or you get to a body lock or you get to the legs or anything like that, it's done. And like I find, especially for jiu-jitsu practitioners who are hobbyists, or for guys like myself who like, I compete, but I'm not like a competitor. I'm not a full-time athlete or anything like that. If we want to work on our wrestling and we're not full-time athletes and we're not taking steroids and all that kind of stuff, we're going to get injured trying to like bang it out on the feet the way that wrestlers do. So we have to figure out ways to train our wrestling that puts minimal, mileage on our bodies. And that's probably the best way, is just to engage in the hand fight, win the hand fight. And so that's another example of something that we have extensively gamified at our academy. And so when I do go out and compete, what I've noticed is, as long as we're talking, like guys in my category, masters, I'm not saying I'm going to be the better hand fighter against some like 80cc guy. Like that's ridiculous. But like competing with equivalent, like black belts in my age category, et cetera, and even going like above my weight class competing. I'm in my 40s. So when I compete locally, I'm often put into a master's category that is like guys in their 30s. Like I can only get equivalent age and weight class black belt competition by going to no-gi worlds. Like I have to compete at big tournaments. So like in my local area, I might be competing against guys that are 2 weight classes above me, or guys that are 10, 15 years younger, that kind of stuff. So in those categories, I have never felt like I was in any danger in the hand fighting department. I know I can always win the hand fight because it's just something I do so much more than a lot of people. And that's another example of something that jiu-jitsu guys don't do enough of.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of hand fighting rounds. I do them all the time now, especially just as a warm-up. I put all the guys through hand fighting, and it's great fun. And so that brings me to the question, I mean, how do you then structure your classes and split it between like game time and full rolling time? Because even now, when I get people doing some situational stuff, I can kind of, maybe it's my own thoughts, but in the back of my mind, I'm like, they're just wanting to go full rounds and just, go crazy.
Yeah. So this is interesting because the thing that you mentioned earlier about like how did being geographically isolated contribute to my development? One of the ways that it contributed to my development as an instructor is when I moved to the town that I live in, I was the first black belt in that town, and I was only the second black belt on Vancouver Island, which meant that if you wanted like good jiu-jitsu instruction in my town, you had to come to me. And if I said drill for 45 minutes, everyone was like, okay, that's what I'll do. Whereas if I had opened up shop in, Vancouver or some other big city, and I tried to teach the way I taught, years ago, maybe people would have gotten bored and gone to the club down the road. Nowadays I've got a reputation for being a skillful instructor. So when I say to do something, people just are like, oh yeah, well, he knows what he's talking about. But back in the day, that could have gone very differently. So over the years, we've developed a lot of different formats for our classes. The current format that we use involves, I try not to overteach. One thing that, like the longer I teach, and in the sense of like the length of my career, the more time I've spent as an instructor, the less material I try to present. So whether it's teaching classes or teaching seminars, so I try to teach less. I want people to get an idea of the main concept and the movement that we're doing, and I want them to experience like either a gamified or a restricted drill that involves that movement. So let's say in an hour-long class, I'll say, okay, guys, let's say we're working on a knee cut pass. There's a basic movement that we're trying to do to just get to the knee cut position. And so we'll go through that movement a little bit, and then I'll immediately have them like situational spar that position. So when I say that position, it's like they'll start with one person standing and the other person on their back, like a recumbent guard with their legs up. And I'll provide some basic rules so that we've gamified the process of sparring to get to the knee cut position. So there usually will not be more than, let's say, 2 minutes of instruction at the beginning. It's just like we want a very basic movement that acts as a warm-up. So one thing I don't like is the traditional warm-up. Like let's run around and do jumping jacks for 20 minutes. I can't stand that. I hated it as a practitioner because I felt like I would rather be doing jiu-jitsu. Like I'm paying to learn jiu-jitsu. I can do calisthenics on my own at home. So we warm up with a movement that's related to what we're doing that day. So we might just do a couple of like entries to a knee cut, and then I'll give a little bit of instruction on what's happening, and then they will spar that. And then if I've designed the class properly, what will usually happen is there will be one obvious problem that arises when people are trying to get to, let's say, the knee cut. And so then the next segment of the class will address that problem and hopefully get them to the next stage. And then sometimes we'll work backwards. We'll go from you're already deep in the knee cut position and you're facing a frame, like an upper body frame. Their arms are in your way. How do you get that? Like once you beat the legs, you're at the hips. How do you finish the pass? And so then again, they'll just spar that. And then after that, we will do a fuck your jiu-jitsu type round that's just sparring, getting to the knee cut and completing the knee cut. And then we'll do a fuck your jiu-jitsu passing round where you can do any kind of passing, but I tell them try to get to the knee cut. Try to use all the other passes to get to the knee cut. And so that process will take about 45 minutes. And then we'll do a couple of other just general fuck your jiu-jitsu rounds. It might be top control. It might be something else. So there will be 10 to 15 minutes of warm-up and instruction, and then a round that gamifies what we did. And then a solution to a problem, and then another round that gamifies what we did, and then maybe a short Q&A where I'll like, hey, does anybody have any questions about this or that? No? Okay, then we'll do fuck your jiu-jitsu. So we do in an hour, we might be, let's say, drilling in the sense of like reps of the technique for maybe 20 minutes. The rest of the time will be a little bit, there might be about 10 minutes of instruction at the most. And then the rest of it will be situational sparring, gamification, fuck your jiu-jitsu, that kind of stuff.
Okay, now the biggest thing I noticed there was maybe the absence of just full free live rolls. Is that?
Yeah, so that in a class, we don't roll. We have a class called a roll-a-thon, which is just an hour of rolling. So a BJJ 101 class would be focused entirely on skill development. And then if you want to roll, you roll for an hour after that. Okay. What I did, and like I want the culture at our club of developing skills and focusing on your own development and taking responsibility for your own learning. So aside from the curriculum classes where we'll have a 201 class or a 101 class, we have a class called the skills development class where there's no formal instruction involved. I show up, class starts, and people just start working on their own shit. They come to class with something to work on, and then I'm just walking around and answering questions, and I'm a very general guide. And then at the end, and there is no sparring allowed of any kind in that class, although you can do fuck your jiu-jitsu.
Okay.
Right? So you can't do sparring. You have to work on a skill. You have to do some game. You can drill. You can do whatever. And then after that, again, there's an hour of rolling. So we get a ton of rolling in, but I try to have it almost be like where there's a separate mentality to what I'm doing to develop my skills versus what is the purpose of rolling. The purpose of rolling, it can be to develop skills. You can definitely roll with an eye towards developing a particular skill. But if you just come to class and drill a little bit and then want to roll right away, I just think the skill development suffers.
Yeah, 100%. And that's somewhere that, like, I've been there myself. I can think back to times where I'm just like, I just want to roll. And I know that that's not the best thing, but whatever, that's just the day. That's the day I was having that I just, come on, I need to choke someone.
Yeah, for sure.
But what I like with what you're doing and the idea of gamification is it really is making that skill development fun. So you can get that kind of release of playfulness and experience through the skill development. It's like a bit of, a spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down approach. And
totally.
Is that what you've found? And have you found that working with your students and instilling that within them?
Yes. So we've been talking obviously a lot about how do we get the best results out of training. The reality of it is I am not a coach to like an ADCC, team or I'm a nerd on an island who is only ever going to coach hobbyists in his life, right? Like the geographic isolation creates another situation where it's like, because of where I'm at, there's not a single high-level athlete that is ever going to come to me for training. Like, if you're a really good athlete where I'm at, you're going to go play hockey. you are not going to come to me for jiu-jitsu. There's no funnel of like athletes to my it's just not going to happen. So I had to kind of let go of those sorts of coaching aspirations. Like I get to coach really elite guys every once in a while when I travel, like I coach Episode'e Link, I've coached Bill Cooper. I get like that happens in very small doses, but my day job is I teach 100% hobbyists. Even the guys I teach who compete are just guys who do this for fun. So I can't approach what I do with the mentality of, I don't give a shit about fun. I'm just trying to make champions. Like that is not what I do. And if I did that, I would be a much less successful business owner. Like my school would make a lot less money. So I very much over the last, let's say over the first few years, I was very much that guy. It was just, what is the best way to teach? Let's not worry as much about fun. Over the last few years, it's what is the best way to teach, but how can we have as much fun doing it as possible? And so oddly enough, the gamification stuff, the fuck your jiu-jitsu, like all that stuff we do, it does make it way more fun. Like we used to drill for longer because I was modeling the like the Atos kind of approach, the drill to win, where you just come in and you just drill for like 45 minutes straight. That's what I used to make my students do. And because I'm always trying to find newer, better ways of doing things, I wasn't satisfied with, well, that's how Atos does it, so who am I to do to modify it? I just did more research. One of my the guy I mentioned earlier, Cal, my black belt, he was like, hey man, I was reading some research that shows that people actually learn better when they have a choice in the material. And so we incorporated what we call a split module, where at the beginning of the month, everybody that's in class votes on the material that we're going to present. So you have 2 modules instead of 1, and you can learn the material from either module in any class you show up to. So because it's not like, okay, guys, we're doing Ʇᴏᴏᴡᴜ guard for the month. Well, what if you're not really like a fan of Ʇᴏᴏᴜ guard? Then, well, you're forced to drill Ʇᴏᴏᴜ guard stuff. This way, we vote on it, and you can work on the other. If we might do Ʇᴏᴜᴜ guard and Kimura control. So if you show up that month, you don't like Ʇᴏᴜᴜ guard, well, then you do Kimura control. So we've added elements like that, and then we got rid of the 45 minutes of drilling stuff and reduced the amount of time we're drilling and increased the amount of time we're doing situational sparring or game playing or anything like that. And within a week or 2 of changing the format, students started coming up to me like, man, I'm really digging this new class format. Like, this is just way more fun. So I very much want that to be the student experience. It's like, how can I design a class so that you're getting the best results possible for your progress, but it doesn't feel like it's an onerous task to get there. You feel like you're just having fun doing it.
Yeah, exactly. Because for me personally now, I'm trying to do jiu-jitsu for as long as I possibly can, into my, hopefully 60s, let's go for 70s. Let's keep pushing it as far as we can. Yeah. And I know that, the best way to do that is to, make myself still want to go by making it as fun as possible. And that's what I kind of want to impart onto everyone else, who's just, if people are going to stick around, it's got to be something that they enjoy doing and that they look forward to coming to. And so that is, that gamification seems like such a strong, important element that can play in that, aside from just, hey, full rolling, just, go for each other's necks. And so what are some other ways that you would think would be important to incorporate in just keeping people coming back and doing jiu-jitsu for a long time?
Yeah, that's this is something that I've spent a lot of time working on. This is the advantage of not being, if I was some kind of super high, I guess I'm a decently highly regarded coach. Like, people in the online jiu-jitsu community kind of know who I am, and people like what I do, but I'm not I'm not a trainer of champions, right? Like, in other words, I'm not like, to pick an example, like ʀᴏᴏᴏᴏ Bahal. Like ʀᴏᴏᴏ Bahal is a multiple time champion in his own right, and then he trains world champions, and so because I'm not that guy, if I was that guy, I wouldn't have to worry about the business side. Like I would have some affluent business partner who would provide me with a school, do all the marketing, I would just show up and teach classes. Because I'm not that guy, and because I'm geographically isolated, I've had to learn on the fly how to be a businessman and how to make jiu-jitsu appealing to people where there isn't a jiu-jitsu culture. I don't have access to a community of people who love jiu-jitsu because we're building the jiu-jitsu community where I'm at. Like there isn't this massive, like, in other words, if I was in Vancouver, there are probably 50 schools in Vancouver. If I opened up shop in Vancouver as a instructor of some renown, there would be people who would already been training that might just come to me. And whereas what I've got to do for the most part here is build people from the ground up with no exposure to jiu-jitsu prior to training with me. And that is like a huge majority of my students. And so I've tried to learn more and more about the process of being a beginner and how do you make something enjoyable and how do you get people to develop training habits that sustain enthusiasm and encourage longevity in the sense of like healthy training habits. So the things that I've tried to incorporate over the last few years have been related to like we do an intro for every student, right? Like that's not uncommon. I think most decently well-run jiu-jitsu academies don't just have someone show up and like join a class. You sit them down, you explain etiquette. We always explain the concepts, the base posture structure, frames and levers. We teach them how to do a technical stand-up and a bridge and a hip escape and like fundamental kind of stuff like that. And then they join the class. And then before they actually join the class, though, we will, after having gone through this onboarding process of like, here's some ideas about concepts, here's some movements, I'll go through a training mentality speech or like an explanation. And that explanation is basically, if you come to jiu-jitsu and your goal is to be submitting people within a week or two, you're going to have an awful time. If your goal is to like armbar folks, you're going to hate jiu-jitsu because unless you're some like crazy good athlete, some like 200-pound former rugby player or whatever, you're not armbarring anybody in your first week, month, whatever of jiu-jitsu. You're just getting your ass kicked. And so it's really hard for somebody who's trying to learn a new skill to come in and just get shit kicked and not feel really discouraged. So we give them this, I don't know if it's a trick or whatever, but we basically teach them the notion of incremental goals and how that corresponds to enjoyment. If you come to class and your goal is to armbar someone, every single class you leave for the first few months is a failure. And you walk out of that class having failed and only failed. If you come to class with the mentality that, somebody pulled my head down and I recognized that was broken posture and I pulled their hand off of my head, I just won. Even if you do nothing else through the rest of the role that is successful, you did one thing where you recognized that your alignment was broken, you accessed a lever, and you fixed your posture. And you will do multiple things like that. Like you recognize that your guard was being passed and you put up some frames. There you go. That's a win. So then you leave class having won, having succeeded 5 times, 10 times, 20 times, even though you got your guard passed and you got your back taken and you got choked. That's not what determined your levels of success in class. And so we promote the hell out of that for beginners. Just like you will leave every class having succeeded, and that will get you coming back. And then the other thing that I really emphasize, and this is not just related to like student retention, but it's like, you're talking about, I want to do jiu-jitsu in my 60s and my 70s and my 80s. we encourage rolling to explore and develop, and we discourage rolling super hard all the time. There's a time to roll hard, and it's, if you train 5 days a week and you want to come in and roll hard 1 or 2 days a week, that's cool. If you're getting ready for a competition and you want to come in and roll hard 4 days a week, that's cool. But outside of those contexts, it is not smart, it's not safe, it's not wise to roll hard all the time. And what we do as far as like the atmosphere of our club is guys who come in and try to roll that way, they get discouraged because either we'll make fun of them in a gentle way, right? Like we're not trying to necessarily pick on anyone, but if somebody rolls in a way that isn't conducive to a lot of movement happening, we have phrases like, oh, that guy took his ball and went home, or that guy's, he's trying to win the drill, or, all that kind of stuff. We encourage having an attitude of helping your training partners, being a good student, being helpful. We encourage, like, our number one rule is keep yourself and your training partner safe. The number 2 rule is like, try to have fun and explore and all that kind of stuff. So we create this mentality where we're all just having fun and playing games. And when we roll, we're trying to get better by exploring, as much as possible. And so like the whole atmosphere is have fun and we all get better together. And there are ways of doing that involve very little potential for injury, very little potential for like wearing your body down, and just maximizing your potential for learning and development. And so it comes down to training mentality. It comes down to emphasizing safety and having all these methods, because I would always emphasize rolling safely in the past. But if you don't give people the tools to do so, they might not even be intentionally trying to roll too hard. It's just that if you just go from 0 to rolling, all the rolling is going to be super hard. By having all those games and those incremental steps to full rolling, when you start rolling, you can start the process all over again. You start with, I'm going to take it real easy, and I'm going to ramp up certain aspects of the roll, and I'm going to pick the partners that I do it with. Like, I like to roll hard. Like when I roll with my black belts, man, we do a lot of hard rolls because we can do it safely. Like a safe roll with a hard roll with a black belt can be very safe and can be had at 60-70% intensity. Whereas if 2 white belts roll at 60-70% intensity, they're going to hurt each other. So, yep. I can apply a heel hook on one of my black belts with a great deal of like I can do it pretty hard and never worry about hurting them. And I can be in a submission with one of my higher belts and know that I'm not going to get hurt if I ride the edge, if I go right to the edge of where I got a tap. But I don't ever want my white belts doing that. So we go through a very definitive process of building people up to the point where they recognize how to roll safely by increasing the intensity very gradually. So did that all kind of make sense?
Yeah, definitely did. There was a lot in there that was really good. I especially like the idea of, making beginners appreciate the value of incremental progressions and those little wins that they can get. Because especially I remember once someone was asking me, when do you think I'll get my first tap? And I thought I was giving them, this was a hopeful answer, like, oh, sometimes you got to wait till someone new comes in and then you'll be able to get them. And I thought that was like, yeah, it's on the horizon. And the look of disappointment on their face when I said that, I was like, oh, okay, that was not what they wanted to hear. And so, yeah, making them value that kind of incremental progression makes a lot of sense, and being able to do that. And I guess a lot of that is having control over the culture that you've got there to be able to, set everyone's goals as soon as they walk through the door. And it's surprising that a lot of the people doing something different or unique are actually geographically isolated, it seems, because there is, the big mainstream jiu-jitsu culture that is going to be kind of all encompassing. If you're, right next to somewhere that's, that's got a lot of that going on, that's kind of like what people will expect. And if you try and do something new, out of the mold, a bit different, you're going to cop a lot of questions and a lot of flack. And, the only person who's probably been able to do that successfully, but obviously Eddie Bravo comes to mind as someone who went out of that mold and kind of did his own thing. And I'm wondering, just in terms of on a broader cultural thing with jiu-jitsu, what would be one of the things that you might say would need, or that, if you could change as a whole, would you? Or I guess, maybe you wouldn't, because it gives you a good little advantage of doing your own thing there.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I was on a podcast a couple of years ago, and somebody asked me if I saw that this conceptual approach and this emphasis on well thought out pedagogy methods, because those are two separate things, right? I would say that quite a few more instructors are sort of jumping on board with the idea of teaching concepts. When I started teaching, literally the only guy that was speaking in these terms was Ryan Hall. And then, because at the time nobody had really heard John Danaher talk about, obviously John Danaher teaches very conceptually, but he was such an enigma back then, people didn't know. And to a certain degree, Damian Maya was, but if you hadn't gone out and got his science of jiu-jitsu instructionals or whatever, it's not like that was part of the mainstream. So really the only guy that had a fair bit of exposure was Ryan Hall. And so now it's getting out there more, but I still think we are very much in the infancy of pedagogy approaches. So I would say 5 years ago, I would have said more guys need to teach conceptually. I think that's happening. I think that the industry is changing in that regard. Now I would say more guys need to really invest in developing a pedagogy method, or sign up to bjjconcepts.net, get the pedagogy. We've got one. So I do hope that we can be part of kind of spreading this notion that the way that we teach, it needs to improve dramatically. The state of jiu-jitsu, in, let's say, North America, but in the world in general, has been, I would argue, compromised by I don't want to get too far down a rabbit hole here, but for myself, I opened my school in 2012. Almost everyone I know that opened a school did so in and around that area. And so over the last 10 years, if you opened a jiu-jitsu school, basically since the 2008 financial crisis, you have opened a school in the most unprecedented economic growth period in human history, on top of a explosion in popularity of Brazilian jiu-jitsu, which means that tons of people had money for it, and the demand far outpaced the supply, which conspired to create a market for, you could have garbage skills at teaching and still run a successful school. There is zero market pressure, up until, we'll see what happens now. I think one of the the aftermath of COVID is going to be, you're no longer just going to be able to open up a school if you're a black belt and just make money. And I'm not saying people were making money hand over fist, because there's also this myth, I think, in jiu-jitsu that it's hard to make money running a school. Up until 3 months ago, it was absolutely not hard to make a living. If you were failing, it meant that you were either catastrophically incompetent as a businessman, or you were just in a saturated market. I don't doubt that it's hard to open a school in Los Angeles and make money, but if you went to a new market and just opened a school. Like, literally every single person I know that opened a school in my like relative geographic area, you know, like in British Columbia, Canada, every single person I know that opened a school succeeded. Like no, even the guys who absolutely fucking suck at jiu-jitsu, are not good at teaching, they all succeeded. They all have successful schools in the sense that they are making a living. They're not making a killing, but to me, if you're making a living doing something you love, that's success.
Yeah.
So I think that we went through this period of time where you literally didn't have to be any good. Like, how many stories have you heard of, like, I emailed the jiu-jitsu club about classes and they never got back to me?
Yep.
That would not exist in a truly competitive market where there was more supply than demand. So I think we're about to see who's actually, like, how the importance of like real teaching skill could become more valuable, where because the demand is going to drop for a little while, and I could be wrong, like we could go through a huge recovery. Like, I don't know what the recovery is going to be. If the recovery is enormous and we go through this filtering process where a bunch of schools go out of business, then honestly, it's going to get even worse, because there'll be fewer schools and a whole bunch of people are going to go back to wanting to do jiu-jitsu. And so it's going to matter even less if somebody's good at teaching. So I might be way off on this, but one of the things I think will happen as we reach a saturation point of jiu-jitsu schools, the market pressure is going to change, where you won't be able to get away with being a half-assed teacher, because people have seen what good instruction looks like more and more. They will have seen what fun classes look. It's not just good instruction in terms of quality. It's, man, you go to a class and it's like, I'm doing jumping jacks and I'm learning random moves, and then I roll and I get my ass kicked. And you know, people at the club across town or across the street, the classes are more diverse, and there's this and there's that. So I think whatever it takes to reach that point in jiu-jitsu where you can't just open a school and use sleazy, you know, used car salesman marketing to draw in people, where it has to be quality. Right now, I think the biggest contributing factor, pre-COVID, the biggest contributing factor to the success of a school was just how good was your marketing. You could be a dog shit at teaching, but if you've got decent marketing and you have a relatively affluent area that you open up in, and you like, if you make good choices with locating your business and you have decent marketing, you could be a terrible teacher and you'll succeed. As we get a point of saturation, that should change. And so if I could snap my fingers, I would have it wouldn't be a finger snap, but it literally would be the market forces will demand better pedagogy methodology within jiu-jitsu, and people will be forced to learn how to be better teachers.
Yeah, really great point that I hadn't thought of before. But you know, as you're discussing it, it does seem like that. Instruction quality isn't really taken into account at the different schools, because it's assumed that it's kind of all the same, right? It's just it's going to be the same anywhere. There's no point of differentiation between anyone, so it's not a concern. That
is just down to if I want to be combative, I think that there are affiliations out there that are honestly trying to subvert the notion that there are degrees of skill at black belt. I think that, like, I've been very outspoken about this, especially in my area, about the idea that I think a lot of guys who are wearing black belts shouldn't be wearing black belts. I think that black belt should be indicative of, it's almost like a PhD in jiu-jitsu. Like, if you're not extremely knowledgeable, I don't think there should be such a thing as a time served black belt. I use the phrase merit-based promotion and time-based promotion. And so there are a lot of affiliations that, you know, like, you get your time card and you attend in a certain number of classes and you get promoted. And so there are guys who they show up enough and they eventually get a black belt. And I think there are affiliations that want to blur the lines between a black belt who just showed up for 10 years and a black belt who's legitimately skilled and knowledgeable in a diverse amount of jiu-jitsu, because it's in their interest as a business entity to not have someone be able to differentiate. Well, that guy's a black belt and that guy's a black belt. Well, the differentiating factor right now is competition. How do you say that I'm a really good black belt? Well, I won this tournament. And anything other than that, they just want to try to say, well, that guy's a black belt and that guy's a black belt. I've heard uninformed consumers say, well, this particular guy is a 5th degree black belt. He must be really good. Like, I remember being at a school once training, and 2 guys walked in the door and they're like, hey, you see that guy? He's a 5th or 6th degree black belt. Damian Maia's only a 2nd degree black belt. Can you imagine how good that guy is? Like, and I laugh, but it's like, that's the level of knowledge that people have. And so they see this fat old guy who, let's be honest, is probably not that good at jiu-jitsu because he hasn't learned a new move since the 90s. But he's got all these stripes because we're giving out stripes now for time served. And so, yeah, like, I'm very vocal about that. I think we need, if we're not going to have clearer rank standards, which I think is impossible, by the way, I don't want a governing body to say anything.
Sure.
What I do want is there to be a relatively open and honest conversation within the community about the distinction between merit-based rank and time-based rank. And like, we all know that this, like once you've been in jiu-jitsu for a little while, you know that, like, there are black belts. It's like Joe Rogan says, there are black belts and then there are black belts.
Yep.
There are black belts who strangle other black belts. And then there are black belts who strangle those black belts. And then there are black belts who are world champion black belts. And then there are black belts who win 5 world championships who strangle those black. Like, there's so many levels to this, right? Yeah.
And world champion purple belts who could probably
who could strangle most black belts, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's the thing. And so I personally, I don't think there should be a world championship for colored belts. I think that's laughable. I like, Can you imagine if you like somebody says, I'm an Olympic champion in judo at yellow belt? Like, it's absurd.
And we have that situation.
Right. And I think honestly that I think it's kind of, like, it's good for the sport to have an extensive competition scene, but I think it's bad for the sport that the way we categorize it makes it so that, like, we're selling fake glory to narcissists, because they're like, the IBJJF basically exists on the business model of having someone be able to say, I'm a world champion. Meanwhile, there are 3 asterisks after that. It's like, I'm a Masters 4 blue belt world champion. Like, dude, you are not a world champion. And I'm not trying to shit on the accomplishment. Like,
this poor Masters 4 blue belt.
But that doesn't exist in any other sport, right? Yeah. Like, in other sports, we have there's a junior league, and then there's like you work your way up. And so, like, I get it. We need to have this for jiu-jitsu, but don't call it the world championship. Don't say that I'm like, if you're not a black belt world champion, you're not a world champion. And I think it makes our sport seem kind of clown shoes to an outside observer, because they're like, well, how many world champions are there? Like, it can't be that hard to be a world champion, because I know a world like, there are guys on my island that are like, I'm a world champion. There's a guy who went to it's not even jiu-jitsu, it's like combat submission wrestling world championships in fucking Bulgaria. And it's like, that dude lost at the provincials at purple belt in BC. So, like, what the fuck are we even talking about? So there's this bizarre, like, rank inflation and title inflation that happens. And I'm not down with any of it. I wish we were more on the up and up with these kinds of things. So, yeah.
Although I will say, I do personally want to go do some combat wrestling one day, just because I like the rule set. It's,
Oh yeah, no, like the rule set is great, and I'm sure like the longer it exists, it will become a pretty legit like thing. But you know, it's like, yeah,
I get you. I get you.
it's like, you know, every MMA promotion is like, you know, the Podunk, you know, cage fighting championships world champion. It's like, no, dude, you're not.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and I mean, especially, I could definitely get behind the idea of at a bare minimum of if you win the world championships or you podium, like that should just be an instant promotion. You can't, especially then have multiple year blue belt world champions. It's like, come on. That's
for sure. And like I said, and I get like on the flip side, I don't think that somebody who wins, like, because you'll hear this said of like any blue belt world champion at this point will beat most hobbyist black belts. Like, I don't think that's even a controversial statement to make.
Probably not.
But I'm not of the position where like, oh, just because that guy could beat those black belts means that he should be a black belt. For one, I think probably a lot of those black belts shouldn't be black belts. But there's something to be said for somebody having a narrow skill set and being able to win because they're exceptional at that skill set. So I do think there's a process that we need for getting people up to speed, but I just think we need to be a lot clearer about it. Like, again, the IBJJF benefits from there being no distinction between hobbyists and full-time professional athletes. You know, you got guys who are flying in to the, you know, Houston IBJJF Open and are competing against guys who train 3 times a week and are going to try and see how they do. And then you get these guys who get to have these like crazy highlight reels because they're styling on hobbyists.
Yeah.
And I don't think that is good for the sport because like we need to have a real hard distinction between those pros and the hobbyists. And I don't think that they should compete with each other. I don't think that's beneficial. So
that makes a lot of sense. And so I just want to run then by you a hypothetical scenario because I'm interested in, you know, just focusing on that take of the hobbyist versus, merit-based black belt versus the time-based black belt.
Yeah.
So let's say, you know, I'm nowhere near this situation myself, but if you've got a brown belt who's been working with you, little Jimmy's been with you 10 years, maybe it's going into 11, 12, 13, 14, he's on his brown. You know, he's a good guy, but maybe some things just aren't clicking with him, and he's asking me, "Hey, Rob, maybe is it going to be this year or?"
Okay, so I will like
You see where I'm going?
I absolutely see where you're going. I actually do believe that there are people who will never get a black belt from me.
Okay,
So my belief is that. And actually, there are people who will never get a brown belt from me.
Okay.
There is, if you start, like, let's say you started jiu-jitsu at 35 and you train twice a week, you're the point at where you're like, you get diminishing returns at a certain point, right? Like, if you are not able to put the time in to garner the skills, then at a point where your body starts declining, like I can't give somebody a belt on like theoretical knowledge alone. And that might change. I'm still like, I'm not trying to say that this is the be all end all position, but with where I'm at now, there has to me, purple belt is, it's kind of like the belts in jiu-jitsu mean different things than they do in other martial arts. In other martial arts, black belt is like, hey, you kind of understand, like a judo black belt. A judo black belt is usually about 3 years, maybe 5. And it's considered the belt at which you kind of understand the art. It's not considered this like crazy expert belt. But what we've kind of said about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is if you're a black belt, you know, it's 10 years and you're a doctor and you're this and you're that. So if we're going to say that, to me, you can't be like, you don't become a medical doctor by showing up to university a couple times a week and then eventually like, okay, man, you can do surgery.
Yep.
You don't do it that way. So if we're going to say that black belt is this level of standard in jiu-jitsu, then to me, you got to say that there are people who are just not going to get there. And so for me, purple belt is the new black belt in that sense. In that, like, if you're the guy who shows up a couple times a week and you're just going to train, really casually, I think you're going to top out at purple belt. I think that is a level of skill that just about anybody of just about any level of athleticism, maybe a little overweight, not great diet, not great athlete, but just comes to class consistently. And I'm like, honestly, I've got some people that I train where I'm like, let's see what happens. Let's see how it goes. Because that when I say I think they're going to top out at purple belt, I'm literally just kind of basing that on nothing. It's a hunch. Yeah, it's a hunch. I think that what I consider black belt level is pretty damn high. So, but maybe they get to brown. Mm-hmm. I'm prepared to have my mind changed on it, but my hunch is that purple belt is where somebody tops out if they're that guy who, like I said, they train a couple times a week, they don't take it that seriously.
Sure. So let's say then in that hypothetical, you've got someone maybe topping out purple or brown, and they're like, hey, what do they come to you? What do I need to do to get to I want to get to the next level of belt?
For sure.
Are you going to give them a criteria?
Yeah. So one of the other things that we try to provide our students is a very clear rank structure and requirement. So it would never, I shouldn't say it would never, but it would be unlikely for it to happen that somebody would come to me at purple belt or at brown belt and be like, what do I got to do to get my black belt? Because every step of the way, like I actually just had this conversation today with one of my students. He's like, hey, I was about to talk to you about this before COVID, and now we're going to be getting back to training. What do I need to do? He just got his purple belt before we shut the doors. And now he's like, what do I got to focus on going towards brown belt? And I'm like, well, you got to focus on this, and this. Our rank requirements are very clear, and they're very modular. So like I said, I'm not a fan of you got to show me these moves, because the moves might change, or it's like, oh, show me an armbar from the guard. That's fucking useless. What am I going to do? Test you? You can do an armbar from the guard on a dummy? That's worthless. So the structure of our rank requirements are kind of the same way that we do our classes, which is I need you to demonstrate certain skills. So to get a blue belt, you got to play a couple of different kinds of guards. You got to show me that you can do A-B passing options. You got to show me that you can do an A-B submission sequence from some dominant positions. I don't care what it is. You could be a guy who hits a hip bump triangle from the guard and then turns that into an armbar. Great. There's your A-B submission sequence. It doesn't have to be anything else. You can get a blue belt from me and not know, or no, I shouldn't say not know, but not be super good at the armbar from the guard or from the mount, because that's just not your sequence. If your A-B sequence from the mount is that you go for a guillotine and then turn that into a darce, cool. You might be a guy who just goes mounted triangle and then can only do the armbar from there, and you never do the classic armbar from the mount where you push on the guy's chest. That's fine. You'll get there eventually. So I don't like those kinds of requirements. Right? So, but you need to know one leg attack, and that's usually the straight ankle lock. Right? And then to get a purple belt, you got to show me that you can do pressure passing and movement-based passing, and that you can play 3 guards, and that you understand the leg lock system. But you don't have to heel hook anybody, and you'll still get a purple belt from me. Right? So it's more about, do you have a certain set of skills? And then by the time you get to black belt, man, you got to play 5 or 6 different guards. You got to have pressure passing and movement-based passing and submission-based passing. You got to have a bunch of different submission systems that you're good at. Your leg locks need to be good. You got to have takedowns. And you got to be able to explain Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in a conceptual fashion to people. You need to be able to teach. So I have very high standards. If somebody is a mostly gi guy and they're a pretty damn good purple belt, but they're not good at leg locks. They're not getting a brown belt from me. You know, if they're not, if I ask them a question and they can't explain, or a student asks them, like, if you want to be a teacher, you know, at our club, the kind of the minimum is brown belt for teaching adult classes, although purple belts will fill in. But like, I basically want only brown or black belts teaching classes. So if you're going to aspire to that rank and somebody asks you a question and you can't explain lever-based rotational control, sorry, dude, you're staying at purple belt, right? Like, so yeah, like the requirements are really clear and the standards are really clear. So no one's going to complain because they all see what a brown belt looks like at our club, what a black belt looks like at our club, and they know if they don't live up to that, they're not going to be asking me, what do I got to do to get a black belt?
So I think if it was just you had high standards and the criteria wasn't clear, then it sounds like it's cruel, kind of.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But if you've got the standard, you know, the criteria well set out and it's just high standards, but if people know it and they want to work towards it, then I think that makes a lot of sense. That's reasonable for a sport that values overcoming obstacles and adversity, that such a bit of adversity be put in place to achieve one of the pinnacles of the sport.
I think so. And I think that we do our students a disservice when we blur the lines. And, you know, like at a lot of gyms, there are two different tracks. There's the hobbyist track and there's the competitor track. And like, you get guys who are showing up and they're getting purple belts put on them, and then this dude who's just like murdering everybody, and he's still a blue belt because they want him to win blue belt worlds. And then it's like, and then, I mean, obviously people figure it out. People aren't stupid. They're like, I know why he's not being promoted. But the fact that it's not talked about, the fact that it isn't laid out in front of everybody, like, you know, at my academy, there aren't two tracks. There isn't the hobbyist track and the competitor track. It's just, you get promoted when you're good. You don't have to be a killer competitor, but you got to be good. You got to be able to, you know, like the guys at our school who compete, when they roll with guys at our school who don't compete and they're a particular rank, the rolls are competitive. You know, the guy who competes might win a little bit more because he's in better shape, because he competes and all that kind of stuff. But in terms of pure skill, they're relatively equivalent. So I don't like having those kinds of separate like rank pathways for people. I think it's disingenuous. And again, I think it allows for this blurring the lines bullshit where, you know, oh, I'm going to open a school because I got my black belt. And to be fair, I wouldn't have this opinion be as vocal if I didn't see this done, where a guy who showed up once in a while, doesn't roll that much, doesn't ever compete, but he wants to run a school and he gets a black belt put on him despite being demonstrably shitty at jiu-jitsu, but he pays his affiliate fees and brings a dude out for a seminar and that guy slaps a black belt on him. I fucking hate that, because that guy pretends that he's the equivalent of me or the equivalent of one of my black belts or the equivalent of somebody who's putting real work in to be a good jiu-jitsu practitioner, a good coach, et cetera, et cetera. And that guy gets to skate by and pretend that he's on the same playing field. I don't like that. And if I call that guy out, I'm the asshole somehow. I don't like that.
I hear you on that. No, that's a very reasonable way to put it. And maybe just on that thing of calling someone out, it's been a good conversation, and I just want to shift gears for last question, which is I wanted to just put this one to you, and it didn't come up naturally, so I'll chuck it in here at the end. But just the idea of conspiracy theories and their proliferation within. It seems like a proliferation within jiu-jitsu. Yeah, you can skip this one if you want.
No, I will answer it, absolutely.
So, I mean, maybe to link it all back in, we've kind of been talking about how we construct our knowledge of jiu-jitsu and teaching practices, and that's kind of been the theme of this conversation, is how, you know, the methods we go about constructing that knowledge and basing it on, you know, research and feedback and what we observe and what we've learned from other places. And there's always been a kind of emphasis in jiu-jitsu on, weeding out things that don't work and only using the observable reality of techniques that are based in competition. But yet one thing that does seem to be a bit of a common occurrence is this idea of, there's a lot of conspiracy theories that it just seems to be a common thing in jiu-jitsu that goes around. And I can't kind of seem to square the two. And I'm wondering what your opinion on it is.
What my opinion is on it. Okay. I'm going to bury myself with this answer, but whatever. So first off, I think that I think there are a couple of, and when I say I think, like, these are hypotheses on my part that are like, I would love to be able to test them more extensively. Like, I'd love to be able to grab a bunch of black belts and put them in a room and go through some like really specific testing. But so these are just these are hunches on my part.
Sure.
The first one is that because jiu-jitsu is so kind of empirical and people value personal experience as much as they do, that we have a bunch of guys who have reached a certain level of jiu-jitsu and they value their personal experience above almost any other thing. Like, if I prove to you that the armbar works, and then you get good through personal experience and you're good at arm bars and you have your method for doing the armbar and you believe that works, that's great. If you have no scientific background and you don't know anybody who got COVID and you think very highly of yourself, you may start seeking out confirmation bias type stuff. Like, you will seek out information that supports, especially as a business owner. Like, let's be honest, most people in jiu-jitsu are not highly educated. This, like, it's not like wrestling, where for the most part, if you wrestled at a high level, it means you went to university and you have some level of education. There are a lot of like just dumb fucks who are really good at jiu-jitsu, but if you were to try to like give them a quiz on any like critical thinking, science, any kind of that stuff, they would fail miserably. And they universally are like, let's just be honest, cult attitudes are rampant in jiu-jitsu. There are a lot of guys running jiu-jitsu schools who are just worshipped by their students, and they never get any negative feedback or blowback for their opinions. They're deified at their school, so they can say some hellaciously stupid shit and people will just nod their head. So I think it's a confluence of those factors where you're like, a lot of guys in this business are not well educated. They're very well educated in jiu-jitsu, and they're we definitely live in a world where you can insulate yourself and get your own set of facts if you're within a certain political bubble. And so I think martial arts in general, jiu-jitsu in particular, are going to skew more to one aspect of the political spectrum. That aspect of the political spectrum happens to be more prone to conspiracy theories, period, and happens to be more anti-science in general. And so you just have a confluence of factors where it's like this confederacy of dunces that are talking to each other, and it just lack the self-awareness to know how what they believe about jiu-jitsu is completely the opposite of what they're doing in their life. As a jiu-jitsu practitioner, if a white belt is a jiu-jitsu black belt, if a white belt came to you and started spouting off about jiu-jitsu, you'd be like, shut the fuck up. Why am I listening to your opinion? And yet you go out, all these armchair epidemiologists, armchair statisticians, armchair politicians, armchair economists, et cetera, very comfortable with these opinions. And there's also a factor that I think is significantly contributing to it, which is incredibly stressful times cause people to seek out anything that provides a feeling of certainty, right? Like, let's be honest, the reason religion is as popular in society historically is because it sells certainty. It sells, we've got the answers. So that's all a conspiracy theory provides. It provides somebody who is going through a traumatic time in their life some semblance of control. It's like the world is really fucking scary if you believe that a random virus turned the world upside down and compromised your ability to make a living. And, like that is fucking terrifying, is that can just come out of the blue. But if it's all part of a plan, that's actually very reassuring because it takes the randomness away. It's like if have you seen the movie The Dark Knight where the Joker talks about,
Great movie.
And he talks about that, like where if it's a random event, it's terrifying, but as long as there's a plan, then it's okay. Right. So that's kind of what we're seeing here. It's like, oh, there's a plan. Oh, Bill Gates has created this so that he can inject you with a microchip. Oh, okay, well, cool. Well, then I can just take this one action of not getting the vaccine, and I've got a simple answer that's allowing me to take full control of my life and of my response to this. Whereas if you're just going along with what's going on and you got to have your school shut and you don't know when it's going to be able to open and you don't know what's safe and what's not, then that's fucking terrifying. And most people would rather be comfortable and have that security and reduce that cognitive dissonance than be like, fuck. I'll tell you, for me personally, I have most days over the last 3 months woken up with a sense of uncertainty and anxiety about the world because I know I'm not in control.
It's been scary.
I don't do well with lack of control. I live a life where I have, as an adult, had more control over my day-to-day existence than the vast majority of adults. Like literally, I almost don't have to do anything I don't want to do. I'm a relatively disciplined person, or I'd be a total fucking disaster because I don't have to wake up in the morning. I don't have a wife. I don't have a mortgage. I don't have any responsibilities outside of show up and teach jiu-jitsu. So I could be a nightmare, and I've lived a very fortunate life. And now it's like there's a bunch of shit that's totally out of my control, and I try to educate myself about it, and I try to do what's best based on the best expert advice, knowing also that expert advice is changing because it's a new situation, right? And this is where, frankly, our education system in North America, are certainly a lot of other education systems, don't do our society any favors because people don't know what science is. They think, science says this, and now science says this other thing. Well, that means that science doesn't know what it's talking about. Whereas, people were educated to understand that science is a method, not a monolith. And that this is a new situation, and the more we learn, we have to change our opinion and all that kind of stuff. Then it'd be less apt or less open to criticism. So because people don't know that, now it's easy for them to they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. And this guy who tells me that the lizard people are controlling the and it's all part of the plan, and they just want to control us. It's like, dude, really? And again, if you had some critical thinking skills, you could maybe interrupt this process, but people don't. There's a severe lack of critical thinking, even in a community that likes to think of itself as look at us, we make fun of karate, we make fun of kung fu because those idiots don't spar. But and then they're posting about conspiracy theories and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I think it's a confluence of undereducated people with a tremendous amount of unearned social capital. People look up to jiu-jitsu black belts way too fucking much. They shouldn't. We shouldn't be taken as seriously as we are. It is. I think one of the other. You mentioned before, if I could snap my fingers, man. If I could snap my fingers and change something about jiu-jitsu, I would have some sort of protocol for knocking all of us black belts down a peg several pegs actually. Like, it's something I have in my school. I have got protocols in place to make sure that I don't ever get to thinking that I'm that fucking great, because like, I'm not above it. None of us are above it. You get enough people telling you you're so fucking great, you're going to believe it. And there's an epidemic of that in jiu-jitsu. There are way too many culty practices, and way too many people think that they're qualified to be talking about shit they've got no business talking about. So there you go.
I hear you. I'm glad I asked that question. Now, but
I'm not glad I answered it, because I'm sure some people are gonna, yeah, whatever.
You'll be all right. No, I thought that was pretty diplomatic, actually. So, but who am I to judge? I just put on pajamas and roll around and teach people how to choke each other. I'm certainly no arbiter of good taste. Yeah. But you did bring up something which is very important, I think, which is that, from that personal experience, which is an interesting thing. I hadn't thought about it the way you described it, but just that how people would never take what a white belt said on face value as being an unquestionable truth just on their opinion, but yet it's so common that be applied, that they apply that thinking to other areas that they haven't had experience with themselves. And I had a sleep scientist, Dr. Ian Dunican, on, and he kind of, before he made a comment about a fighter, about fighters, he's like, I don't want to overstep my mark because I've never fought. And I said, well, a lot of fighters are pretty quick to overstep their mark into science, so feel free.
Well, so this is an interesting thing that you bring up, because it's funny how often you'll hear a scientist or anyone who's got either scientific training or even just is scientifically inclined, they're so quick to be like, I don't want to speak about this. And if they do, like, I tend to speak about the topics outside of jiu-jitsu, but when I do, all I'm doing is speaking on, like, with reverence to the education that I've received or the information that I've received from experts. Like, if I'm talking about cognitive learning strategies, I'm going to be like, hey man, I don't know that much about this. Here's what I do know. And all I'm doing is repeating what I've learned from an expert in the field in a lesser, in a less cogent fashion. Like, I can explain basic physics, but as soon as we start to go beyond that, I'm like, man, I don't know. And I think anybody who has any kind of scientific training, that brings with it a certain amount of humility about speaking, even on another scientific topic. Like, a guy who's an expert in one, part of physics will be like, well, if I'm going to talk about this side of physics, I'm overstepping my bounds. Whereas in just like general society, in people who don't have a scientific background, they're very comfortable talking out of their ass, because there has been in my opinion, a concerted effort over the last, I would say, 30 to 40 years on the part of certain political actors in North America, but probably more, around the world as well, to undercut the validity of expertise, to try to make it so that expertise matters less, scientific knowledge matters less, so that they can have a debate with this a false equivalency, where there's a logical fallacy of of equal argument, of like, there are always two sides to a story. There are not always two equally valid arguments. Just because there are two arguments doesn't make them equally valid. That's a fallacy, and I think there's been a concerted effort and a very politically motivated one to make it so that people will view expert opinions and any other opinion on an equal basis. And this has been done in a very calculated fashion to undermine, the validity of scientific expertise. And I think it's a tragedy. I think it's going to contribute to. I think it already has. I think anyone who's viewing, current world events can see what happens. Look at the countries that are run by intelligent individuals with scientific training: Germany, Taiwan, South Korea. Look at countries that are governed by, and I use the word charismatic in quotations, by charismatic idiots. And I don't mean just the one that most people are going to think of. There are many of them. There are many charismatic idiots, including the one running my country. So like I say this without political affiliation. I'm not trying to throw any one political leader under the bus. I'm saying that electing people who are fucking morons to office, regardless of their political stripe, has bad consequences. And I think that we as a society and we as jiu-jitsu practitioners within a community need to raise our standards of who we listen to and who we elevate in terms of opinion. And if they're not highly educated, if they don't have some sort of expertise, then we shouldn't listen to a goddamn thing they say. So if you're going to listen to black belts who have no expertise outside of jiu-jitsu, completely ignore them. They've got literally nothing to offer you in terms of a valid opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that. And maybe to wrap it all up and bring it back round to martial arts, to tie it in a nice little bow. As you were saying that, I was thinking about what I would, when I corner fighters, and I'll be cornering for kickboxing fighters, but the fighters will have their full-time kickboxing coach with them, Nick Pudney or Chad Lumley, who I work with. And, and sometimes I'll be in the corner and I just want to yell something out because I'm there, I'm pumped up. But they've got the guys, their padmen who they've been working with, and I'm here helping out. But I really want to yell something out. So what I'll do is I'll listen to what those guys are saying and I'll just yell that out. And I think,
exactly, yep.
And I think, I don't know, I like that approach. It's the one I'm doing myself, and I think it can work.
Yeah, I think like that. If you have any voice in whether it's in our jiu-jitsu community or in the wider community, and you want to speak with that voice outside of your area of expertise, speak with that voice to amplify the voices of experts, and you can't go wrong.
I think that's a good way to wrap this one up in a bow, and cool. Maybe we can come back in another time in the future and just delve deeper into those things as well, because I think it's been a great conversation, Rob. I've really enjoyed it.
I would absolutely love to. I've really enjoyed the conversation as well. I had a blast talking to you, so I'd be happy to do it again.
Thank you so much. If people want to get in touch with you, I know you got bjjconcepts.net. I know you've even got a live-in residency program or something. I'll try to touch on it as briefly as possible. Obviously, it's not happening right now. Sure. But we have a visiting student. It's been brutal. It's like I'm looking at my calendar now, and it's like I had all these visitors scheduled, and it's like, well, that guy's not coming. That guy's not coming. That's not happening. We have a visiting student program. We host jiu-jitsu practitioners from all around the world. All you have to do is get here. So the idea is it's free. I have a 3-bedroom home. 2 of those bedrooms are dedicated to visitors, and like we've had as many as 5 people staying at my house at any given time. They stay with me. They train for free at my academy for a week, and yeah, there's no catch. We've done it for years. Over the last probably 3 or 4 years, we've probably averaged between 50 and 80 people every year, from all around the world. We actually have had quite a number of visitors from Australia, a lot of visitors from the US, around Canada, Europe, South America, Asia, really just about everywhere. So yeah, it's a great program that has allowed me to undercut my asocial tendencies, because if I didn't have this program, I would literally never speak to another human being outside of jiu-jitsu class. So it's been really beneficial that way. So yeah, if somebody wants to get in touch with me, I'm on Instagram, although I hate social media, but I am on Instagram at Island Top Team. We also have an Instagram account for BJJ Concepts, so at BJJ Concepts. And you can get in touch with me through bjjconcepts.net, through the email there. And yeah, when things get back to normal eventually, the visiting student program will resume. I now have a backlog of people that I have to get out here who were supposed to visit over the last few months. But I will find room for anybody who wants to visit. And hopefully, if you're ever inclined to travel, come out here and visit us. I'd love to. Whenever the borders open back up, after we get the microchip, we'll be right to go. All right, Rob, it's been beautiful, mate. I'd love to do it again in the future, and have a great day.
Awesome. You too, man.
You have been listening to the Sonny Brown Breakdown. Until next time, you can visit sonnybrown.net to find out more ways to break it down.